Okay, folks, how's it going? Hello, hello. Professor, do we have questions today? Maybe. We'll see. Okay, so in fact, what I'll do is I'm going to kick off. We were halfway through the behavior lecture, if you remember. And so, oops. And what I haven't done is I haven't opened my iClicker thing, have I? Okay. So let me see. iClicker. There we go. Just get that going. And you've seen all the answers already. Well, there we go. That's good. And I'm going to start a class, okay? And I'm going to find you guys on the screen again. Okay. So pull the iClicker. I got way too many things open right now. I think the iClicker shut down again. Sorry. So many damn things open. Okay. iClicker. Okay, let's open that again. Yeah, that shut down as I try to move it. There's not much scope for clicking in the wrong spot. Okay. Okay, now my clicker is being slow. Start. Okay, so start class in progress. Okay, it's got the iClicker is stuck on somewhere on my screen, so I can't see it. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen a second because it's messing stuff up here, okay? Resume. Okay, there's my clicker thing. And I cannot move it. There it goes. Okay. Oh my word, that was a pain. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, there we go. And I'll get the PowerPoint up again. There we go. And you've seen all the stuff. Okie dokie. So what we'll do is we'll kick off with some of these questions, right? So I'll start with this question here. So we were doing the behavior thing last time, okay? Behaviorism versus ethology, okay? That was something we talked about at the very beginning of the class, right? And so here, you know, the question is behaviorism studies a single gene versus ethology studies multiple genes, etc. as you go down that list. Individual animal versus groups of animals. What are you asking, though? We only have choices A through E. Professor, what is the question? Behaviorism versus ethology, what is the difference? Okay. Is it that behaviorism studies single genes, whereas ethology studies multiple genes? Or is it that behaviorism studies individual animals and ethology studies groups of animals? Okay, does that make sense? Is it that behaviorism studies conditioned reflexes, whereas ethology studies unconditional reflexes, etc.? Unconditioned reflexes versus conditioned reflexes? Or is it that behaviorism studies lab animals and ethology studies animals in their natural environment? Okay. Okay, so we've got 178 people on the session and 156 have answered so far. Okay, 167, 170s. Okay, two more people if they're okay. That looks like it. Okay, we're getting more answers now than on session. People opening up their apps while they're somewhere else. Okay, so I'm going to close that down, and let's go on to look at the answers here. Okay, just try and get my screens organized again. Okay, so what we discussed at the beginning of last lecture was that we started off by talking about behaviorism and that it looks at lab animals, and then we started talking about ethology, which is more the study of animals in their natural environment. Okay, and so when we talked about behaviorism, we talked about Pavlov and conditioned reflexes in dogs, salivating, and then we also talked about Skinner put C first, then change to E. Okay. Then we talked about Skinner and these rats that we'd have in the Skinner box and the operant conditioning. You could teach them to behave in certain ways depending upon a positive or negative stimulus. And then we looked a little bit about, was it E or C? It was the E. Okay. This one here, E. Behaviorism studies lab animals and ethology studies animals in their natural environment. Okay. Can you explain why it isn't C? Okay, so the reason why it's not C is when Pavlov was looking at these dogs, he was looking at the conditioned reflex, conditioning the reflex to this metronome that he would put, and they would learn to that. The unconditioned reflex was the fact that the dog salivated with food anyway. That was an innate, unconditioned reflex. Okay, so it's part of this sort of study of Pavlov's. Okay, and that's the reason why it's not C. Does that matter? It's not confirming the answer, is there? Choose E, but it shows point. Okay, I can't deal with all individual questions related to iClicker right now. Okay, so, and we talked about with ethology, Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen on their sort of behavior with, we talked about Nico Tinbergen's work on gulls. Yes, you're correct. I haven't marked that as, that's the reason why, E. Okay, correct. So it'll have that full mark now, okay. Imprinting with Konrad Lorenz and the Wagglebee dance with Carl von Frisch, okay. Okay, what have we got next? Okay, so our next question here is an experiment used a mutagen to produce fruit flies in which a typical behavior was disrupted. So which of these statements do you think is true, that a mutation may have occurred in one of several genes to cause that of disrupted behavior? A mutation must have occurred, it must have occurred in multiple genes. They found the gene for that behavior. The experiment prevented flies from imprinting, or the behavior is probably learned, not genetic. Okay. Give you a chance to answer those, and then we can work through some of those. Okay. Wait, Professor, can you read it? Can you restart it? It's not letting me answer. If I stop it and restart it, it creates a huge mess like last time where I have to go in and delete individual questions. So okay, I can see that 150, I don't see it. I can see 163 people have responded. So I know some people can see it. A lot of us can't answer it. Refresh. If I do that refresh. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it now because I got 184 responses. It just says no response. Okay. And I'll look at the iClicker afterwards. Okay. If I refresh the app, I know it's going to create problems. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to close that down there, and we can resolve issues at a later time. Okay. Sorry, iClicker is iClicker, right? No, not your professor. Okay, telling students to refresh. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the answer to this is a mutation may have occurred in one of several genes. Okay. So let's see. Okay, A. Good, that's the correct one there. And so there are sort of like, you know, we talked about the fact, just going through some of these, that this was an example that we gave of the fact that although a mutation in a single gene can cause a disruption in behavior, genes that control behavior typically act in a cascade. This was an example that we gave it because there is no such thing as the gene, right? I mean, in some cases there might be the gene for a trait, but it would be a very rare thing. Typically, it could be a gene, okay, that controls the behavior. That's correct. We gave this example of here of this cascade of genes that control fruit fly courtship dances, and how the way that these genes are spliced at the beginning. In females, it's spliced one way that affects then how the next gene is spliced, that affects then how the next gene is spliced, etc. This double sex controls sex morphology. Fruitless controls the male courtship dance. So you could have a mutation in you know, any one of these sort of sequence of genes, and it could disrupt downstream behavior. Okay, you could have mutations in multiple genes, but the question said that a mutation must have occurred in multiple genes for B. So that's not true, because it could have occurred in a single gene. Okay, so that's where we got to with respect to the behavior. Okay, so I'm just going to close that down and get to where we were in this discussion. Okay. Okay, so this is where we were last time, and basically we were talking about how it's beneficial to have some time control over when you display a behavior, because you don't want to display a behavior at a time when it's non-beneficial to you, so it makes you more vulnerable to predators or something. You only want to display it at a time when it is beneficial. Okay. So this was the example that we started talking about, and this is a demonstration that hormones can control the development, but also the timing of behavior. Sorry, I'm just trying to look at the closets here. And not the closets, the comments, something about, okay, sorry. And so this was an example in rats. And so they, as part of their sexual behavior, the females have this display called lordosis, where they're receptive to mating, and the males, when they want to reproduce, they engage in mating, basically. And there was a series of experiments done that showed that hormones control the way in which that behavior is expressed. And it's not just the hormones at the time of sexual reproduction. So they did experiments. This is an example in females where they looked at the gonad condition, which produces the sex steroids, in juveniles and in the adult case. And this key below here gives the key to how they did this experiment. So in this example, they had a female rat, and in the juveniles, so this female symbol here, black, indicates that they had an ovary in a natural condition. Okay. In the adult stage, this individual here, it had had its ovary removed, but then it received female sex hormones, as if the ovary was there, okay? And it displayed this lordosis, the typical female sexual behavior. This rat was the same, except for once the ovary had been removed, they gave it testosterone instead, so the male hormone, and it did not engage in lordosis. So they did a series of these types of experiments. So in this one, the ovaries were removed in the juveniles, so they received no steroid, no potential hormones at that stage, and then they were implanted with either female or male sex hormones as adults, and they behaved in the same way. The females display, or those with the female sex hormones as an adult, displayed lordosis. But if, when you remove the ovaries as juveniles and give them testosterone as juveniles, and then give them either female or male sex hormones as adults, what happens is you no longer get lordosis in the female sex hormone adults, and the male sex hormone adults engage in mating behavior as if they're a male, even though these are genetic females, okay? Now, when the males, so genetic male individuals, they did equivalent experiments. So here they have their testes intact as juveniles, and then they're removed and given either female sex hormones or male sex hormones as adults, and they mate. Those with the testosterone as an adult mate as a normal whale would. But if you remove the testes in the juveniles and give them female sex hormone as an adult, then they display as a female. But nothing occurs in terms of the male sex hormone as an adult. And in the final stage, they implanted testosterone in the juvenile stages after they'd had their testes removed, and then gave them female or male sex hormones as adults. And the only thing that happens is the one with the male hormone implants engages as a typical male. So the outcome of these experiments were that male sexual behavior requires testosterone exposure as a juvenile and as an adult. If you look through all these different treatments, mating behavior here, 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 and each one of the examples, you have the testosterone as a juvenile as well as an adult, okay? So here, this is the juvenile condition. If you have the testes equivalent, no matter what sex you are, you will mate if you also get the testes equivalent as an adult, okay? If you express testosterone or have testosterone implanted as an adult, but you have not had testes or testosterone as a juvenile, you will not engage in mating behavior, okay? Sorry, I'm just looking at a comment there. Can you go back one slide, please? Okay. Let's have a look. Is this the slide you mean, Morgan? Okay. One more. Okay. So here, this is saying that these are genetic males. They have the testes as juveniles, or they have them removed, or they have implants, etc. Okay. Oh, the symbols aren't on our slides. That must be some display issue. I'm not quite sure what's causing that. Okay. And is anybody else having that issue where the symbols are not present on the slide? Or is everybody, most people good? Maybe it's just a system thing. No, as in no, you're not having an issue, or no, they're not there. I see it. Okay, so most people see it. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so it must be your particular system you're displaying it on, I'm afraid. Just a small chart on the side, isn't there? Okay. Oh yeah, the small chart on the side is not there because I put that in last night, okay? Okay, and when the females, Sexual behavior requires female hormones as an adult only. It doesn't matter what you're exposed to as a juvenile, as long as it's not testosterone. Okay, so here you can have lordosis. You've got adult female sex hormones here again and here again. But in this example, they had testosterone as a juvenile, and in that example there, and this example there. And then that stops it behaving in that manner. So basically, the outcome of this is that hormones at different times during development affect the behavior that an animal might express. Okay, and it could be a combination of hormones at different times throughout its life. Okay, so that you're expressing the appropriate behavior at the appropriate time. Okay, in terms of timing of behavior, something we mentioned briefly last time as well was this concept of imprinting. Okay, this is something that Lorentz worked on. And so some behavior types are only acquired during a so-called critical period of development. Okay, critical period is determined in many cases by a brief hormonal state, and a famous example of this, Lorentz, one of the people that we talked about previously, who won a Nobel Prize with others, he worked on grey-legged geese imprinting and found that they imprinted on their parents within a period of 12 to 16 hours after their hatching. At that point in time is when they sort of said, okay, that's my parent, and I'm going to imprint on that thing and follow it around as if it's my parents. And he was able to demonstrate this by raising birds in captivity and then exposing them either to himself or different things that they would imprint on and follow him around. So here's an example of these little geese following him around because they imprinted on him. He also did experiments with these different workers who wore different colored boots at the critical period. And then when all these little chicks were in a big group together, people with different colored boots on could sort of walk in different directions, and those little chicks that had imprinted on different colored boots would sort of separate out according to those boot colors. Imprinting is also can be important in terms of conservation biology. Does smell affect bird imprinting, or is it just what they see? Don't know. So sheep and lambs, I think they sort of I'm not quite sure about the smell issue. I mean, I know that smell is important in you know, many animals, perhaps for parent recognition. I'm not sure. But in conservation biology, this can be important, and a good example of this is in condors, California condors, which a few decades ago there was just a handful of these things left in the world, and they were all brought into captivity for breeding programs, and then they release the animals later into the wild, and they don't want those chicks to imprint on humans. And so when they rear them, they have these little hand puppets that they feed them with when they're chicks. So they're imprinting on something that looks like a, you know, an actual condor bird, basically. And another good example of this is with father emperor penguins. So they nest about or lay their eggs about 150 kilometers from shore, and the mother and father take turns and walking all the way back to the coastline, going foraging, and then coming back to the nest again, or to the chick again to feed it. And in one of the stages of this, the father comes back and the mother has already gone. And so he needs to be able to recognize his own individual chick in this mass of you know, birds that are there. And the father imprints upon the chick's call, and that's how they find the individual chicks again to feed them. Okay, so in this example here, we're going to talk about the fact that we talked about how, you know, often genes control behavior, but it's a whole, and we talked about how hormones can control behavior. So behavior is actually being controlled by host of different aspects all acting together. And this is an example in bird songs showing that there's a genetic component, some imprinting involved in their behavior, and physiology, and also social interactions as well. Okay. So in male white-crowned sparrows, they have, this is a picture of it here, they have a species-specific courtship song. So when the males want to mate, they make a certain song and a certain sound that is distinctive of that species that females will respond to in terms of mating to occur. And so this figure on the right, they show these so-called sonograms, which plot these bird songs. So this is time on the x-axis, and then this is the frequency of the sound that they're making. So a typical male song is like the web styles and spiders. So to a degree, so that web example that we showed was the deprivation experiments that indicated that behavior was being controlled genetically. Okay, so what they did was got spiders, raised them so they've never seen anything else at all in their life. Okay, but nevertheless, they can still build a web. Okay, it's hardwired in them. This is a bit like that because some of that deprivation part does come into this, but it shows that there's a more complicated picture than just that web building. Okay, there are other things required in this. So this is the what a normal bird song looks like if you record it and display it in this manner. What they were able to show is that these birds have, the male birds have 2 critical periods that they need to go through in order to produce this species distinctive or mating song. First of all, they must hear conspecifics. So conspecifics means you know, birds of the same species. Yeah, so somebody's put a link to different bird songs. There's actually a great app I have on my phone that you can go out when you walk outside. You can click a little button and it starts recording sound in just this manner. And when you hear something, I use it a lot outdoors, you hit pause and you can swipe over an area and it identifies the bird for you. It's actually really cool. Okay. It must hear a conspecifics song when it is a chick, when it's less than 2 months old. Okay. So this is an example here where a bird was isolated and, when it was hand reared, and it never heard its father or other male birds singing. Okay. You let it grow up and you let it mature, and then it starts singing. And this is what it produces. It tries to make a sound, and it's something vaguely like this, but it's not species specific. This wouldn't be recognized by another female, and the female wouldn't approach it. So it needs to hear its father or other male birds singing when it's a little baby chick in the nest. Okay. The other critical period is that, so the testosterone, as they mature and become sexually mature, is what turns on their singing during the breeding season. And when that happens, they have to be able to hear themselves singing and practicing, basically, like, you know, singing in the bathroom, basically, and to refine the song to get it right, to produce this. And so this poor little bird down here was deafened. And so it could try practicing, but never be able to hear itself. And it does not produce the correct song. And the interesting thing is that even in females, they are able to produce this song if you inject them with male sex hormones. So testosterone triggers male singing in the spring, also if it's injected into a female. So the females are actually doing the same thing. They're sort of like learning it and can practice it and can go through this whole process as long as they get these critical periods and as long as they get some testosterone. And this is under strong selective pressure because females only mate with males singing the correct song. So if you as a male don't do that, genes that you're carrying that might be controlling this behavior will not be passed on to future generations. So what's the bird that never heard the father sing, not able to sing the song? Yes. So this guy never heard its father singing. It tries singing, but it's not able to produce the species-specific sound. And this one never heard itself practicing later on in life as it was becoming mature. It still sings, but it does not produce a species sing. So can it not mate? It cannot mate because a female will not engage in courtship behavior with it, okay? Or at least it's unlikely to, I'm guessing. So then that creates a strong selective pressure, okay? Okay. So we've talked about, that's sad, okay, I guess it is sad. We've talked about different types of studies, methods of study of behavior. We talked about ethology, for example. Another discipline can be categorized under so-called behavioral ecology. There are books, you know, called behavioral ecology, etc. And so behavioral ecologists are interested in how changes in behavior adapt animals to their environmental conditions. So what is the benefit of behaving in different ways, basically? So behavior has a genetic component, and therefore, as I mentioned, it must be subject to evolutionary forces. And the frequency of alleles that affect behavior can change with respect to selection. So, which is pretty much the definition of evolution. So, with that birdsong example, for example, if you had genes that were giving the wrong song, they would not be selected, and so they would that evolution would occur in terms of those genes being bred out of the population. So in terms of this evolution of behaviors and the benefits ecologically and adapting to your environment, this can be thought of as a cost-benefit analysis, something we talked about in a previous lecture. So behaviors have certain costs and they have certain benefits. So for example, if you're a male defending a territory or a bird singing to defend a territory and attract mates, the benefits are that by doing that behavior, you attract more mates and you can produce more offspring. Okay, so those genes will be selected. But oftentimes those behaviors are going to incur some kind of a cost. So for example, if you're, there are energetic costs in terms of patrolling your territory, fighting other individuals. Singing has actually been shown to be energetically expensive. There are risk costs. So if you're making lots and lots of noise, you're telling predators, for example, that you're there. Okay, so you're making yourself more vulnerable to predation. And there are also so-called opportunity costs. So if you're spending all your time defending a territory, you can't be doing something else like feeding, for example, so gaining energy. So you're doing one thing instead of potentially something else that might benefit you. So these behaviors have some sort of cost benefit associated with them. And a good example of this is an experiment that was done on Yarrow's spiny male lizards. Okay, so these are lizards that during the mating, during the breeding season, they go out and defend their territory. So they have highly defensive of their territories during the mating season. And it's been shown that testosterone is what drives that territorial behavior. So in this experiment, which was designed to look at the costs of that territoriality, what they did was they examined lizards outside of the breeding season. So their testosterone levels go down outside the breeding season, and they stop doing as much of this, you know, territorial behavior. Okay. And so what they did with these lizards was they implanted some of them with testosterone, so that it was if they were it was the breeding season. And in the control group, they implanted them with the same thing, but without the testosterone. Okay. And so what they found was, so on this top graph, at certain times of the day, these lizards became active and started being territorial. And in the control group, the blue ones, initially in the morning, they were quite active, and then they drop off basically, and they're sort of like just ticking along. But in the experimental lizards that received testosterone, they engaged in territoriality and were active throughout the whole day, as if it was in the breeding season. So what they found was that the experimental males with the extra testosterone, they spent more time defending their territories, shown here. In doing so, they expended about a third more energy. And also they fed less, because that was that opportunity cost that they were defending, and so therefore they couldn't be out feeding instead. And as a result, they stored less energy. And the real issue here is that these lizards had lower survival. So this is survival on the y-axis on the bottom graph over time, over a couple of months or so. The control lizards had fairly good survival. Some of them died, but 90% or more survived. About 10% died. But in the experimental ones, their survival went way down. Okay, down to about sort of 50% or so. Okay, so no, they don't know. What are the odds costs? So I can't follow all the comments at exactly the same time. Okay. So basically, engaging in this costly behavior at a time when it's not benefiting you because you're not reproducing, reduces your fitness because you have a lower survival. That's the bottom line of that experiment. Okay. Another example of this is so-called optimal foraging theory. Okay. What is the best way that you can accumulate food? And so a lot of these experiments to be done on fish with the optimal foraging theory. So when you are out feeding, okay, feeding behavior has got certain costs. There are energetic costs in going and searching for food and capturing and processing that food. There are also risks of foraging. Increased vulnerability to predators. So instead of being in a shelter, for example, you might have to be out looking for food and concentrating on finding food and make yourself more vulnerable to predators. And there are opportunity costs that we discussed. So maybe you can't be doing other things like defending your territory or finding a mate or something. But the obvious benefit is that you have nutrient intake. You need to feed to survive. So it makes sense that if you are out feeding in this kind of environment, that you should maximize the rate of energy intake that you have per unit time, so that if I need 2,000 calories to survive for the day, if I can get those 2,000 calories in 5 minutes, then that's a good thing, as opposed to taking me 12 hours to get those 2,000 calories, because in the rest of the time, I could be doing something else that's beneficial to me, or I could be reducing my risk. Sitting at home in my shelter, reducing my risk to predators. Okay. There's a little video on this, on the experiments that were done in bluegill fish. I'll leave you to watch that at home in the interest of time. Okay. And it's trying to play that on the web. Okay. Great. So okay, so behavioral physiologists. So this is another kind of like discipline of exploring behavior. Are interested in what physiological mechanisms underlie proximate causes of behavior. So proximate causes means what is the actual, when you open the hood and look under the hood, what is actually sort of driving those behaviors? And we talked about genes, for example, as being involved in that. But what are the roles of things like the nervous system, the endocrine system? So we talked about hormones, vision, etc. And what we're going to do is talk about circadian rhythms as an example of this. Okay. So a circadian rhythm is a daily rhythm in behavior that is inbuilt to pretty much most types of organisms. It comes from circa, meaning about, and dien, meaning day. And a good example of the way that people study this is to look at rodents in the laboratory. And they use this little apparatus here. So here is a lab rodent, and just voluntarily, what they tend to do is that they get on these little spinning wheels and they run around them when they're up and about and active. And so that's a nice way that you can log their behavior, because this little spinning wheel could be linked to a data logger that records when this thing is spinning and when it's not, and that can be used to show periods of activity and non-activity for these rodents. And this can be expressed in this so-called periodogram here, which is basically a plot showing their behavior. So the way that these plots work is, on the top row here, this is day 1 during the light and then during the dark. And these little gray bars indicate when this wheel was spinning around, when they were active, basically. So this is 1 day here, and then this is the 2nd day of with the light and the dark. And then now you go down to more time here. And the way that this is done is this day 2 is repeated in the first block on the 2nd row. So it's day 1, day 2, day 2, day 3, day 3, day 4, etc. Okay, and you can see that these things, it's pretty obvious that they're active at nighttime when it's dark, and only a little bit active during the daytime. If now you expose these, the gray bars are when they are active. Correct, that is when they are active. Okay. So if you then expose these things to just constant darkness, you take away any light signal whatsoever, you find that actually they carry on expressing some kind of an inbuilt rhythm, okay? Although it's not perfectly 24 hours. So these ones are getting slightly ahead of themselves, drifting over time. But nevertheless, that's why it's a circadian rhythm. It's about 24-hour built-in time period they have. So although it's drifting, there is still this strong inbuilt rhythm that they maintain over the period of, a couple of weeks or so, okay? You can bring them back into their proper cycle by entraining them, and you can do this with just a 20-minute exposure of light, this narrow little yellow bar here, before they would ordinarily experience nighttime, okay? And this resets their clock for them each day, okay? So now they've, over the next couple of weeks or so, they've started giving 20 minutes of light just before when darkness should occur, and over a few days, now their clock is reset. Okay, so this circadian rhythm is generated partly internally and partly through external entraining. So there's some kind of an internal clock that is being used in these mammals to have this circadian rhythm. And so one of the questions is, where is this so-called internal clock? This is an experiment, it's actually a pretty neat experiment that was done in hamsters, again, running around on wheels, etc. And in these hamsters, when they're exposed to normal conditions, they had a typical circadian rhythm, active at part of the day for a shorter period than in the rats that we showed before, and then inactive for some of the day as well. Okay, if you've got a pet hamster, you'll know that they're kind of annoying at nighttime. Now, in this experiment, they were exploring the role of the so-called suprachiasmic nuclei. Okay, these are 2 clusters of neurons just above the optic chiasm, which is where you have optic nerves from each eye, and they go back into your skull, and they cross over to opposite hemispheres in your brain. And that point where they cross over is where the optic chiasm is. And this suprachiasmic nuclei is located just above that, okay? So in this experiment, what they did was they removed that SCN from these hamsters and then looked at their activity, and the hamsters became arrhythmic. In other words, there was no discernible, they were active sometimes, but there was no sort of like predictable rhythm to it at all. Then what they did was they transplanted a fetal SCN tissue from another hamster, okay? So fetal meaning it could now, at an early stage of development, and it could regrow within that hamster that they were doing the experiment on. But this was the cool thing about the experiment, is they had also in the lab bred some different strains of these hamsters that had periodicity, but it was different. So some of them had a short period and some of them had a long period. And they got one of these mutant strains and found that they could restore this rhythmic behavior, but the behavior that it adopted was not exactly like the original hamster. It actually adopted, it took on the behavior of the mutant strain, okay? It was a restored activity as that of the donor tissue, right? Okay, they had this short day strain and it restored that. So that demonstrates very clearly that this suprachiasmatic nuclei is involved in the control of that behavior. Okay, also in terms of the proximate mechanisms of how these circadian rhythms are controlled. We had talked earlier in the previous lecture about the period gene. That was discovered in fruit flies by exposing fruit flies to mutagens that would cause mutants to occur, and then screening lots of offspring and finding individuals that had a change in their behavior. Discovered in the 1960s and sequenced in 1984, led ultimately to a Nobel Prize. Okay, it's mentioned on here, Nobel Prize in physiology. So that's a third of the Nobel Prizes in behavior that we've covered during the course of the lecture. So how does this internal clock work? So there are a whole host of genes involved in controlling circadian rhythms. Period is just one of them. Period was discovered in fruit flies, but we actually have homologs of them, 3 homologs of them in ourselves, in humans. So the protein has a 24-hour lifespan. When it's gone, cycle resets. Yes. Well, yes, the dimer does. So what happens is this period gene is transcribed into messenger RNA and translated into the protein, the period protein, okay, in the cytoplasm of the cell. And when it's in the cytoplasm, it forms a dimer with another protein produced by the thymus gene. So this blue here, they form a dimer that re-enters the nucleus and it switches off that period gene. So it goes out, forms a dimer, comes in and switches itself back off again. But this dimer decays over time. And as it does, period gets turned back on again, okay? And the periodicity of this entire cycle is about 24 hours. So that is how it's sort of generating this 24-hour period, okay? Let me just look at the notes here. Protein physically interact with humans have 3 homologs. Okay, yes, I think I've said all of that. Okay, so that's some of the, again, some of the proximate mechanisms by which it is occurring. Okay, so we talked a little bit about social interactions. For example, in those birds that we're having to learn to sing, we're having to learn songs from their parents. What I'm going to talk about now is social interactions and the evolution of mating systems. We don't have time to go into this in detail, but we're just going to sort of mention some of the different types of mating behaviors that have evolved in different groups of animals. Okay, so males and females are both. So when animals are trying to reproduce, males and females are both trying to maximize their own reproductive success, right? So if I'm a male bird, I want to make sure that I have as many chicks as possible, and if I'm a female bird, I want to make sure I have as many chicks as possible. But sometimes, or often, there's conflict, sexual conflict between what is most beneficial for one another. Professor always said eggs are expensive, sperm is cheap. Yes, so that is true. Eggs are expensive and sperm is cheap, okay? So exactly, here we go. So females, large energetic investment. So you think about the size of a of an egg, if you think of a chick egg, for example, all that energy that goes into producing that, and it has to be fertilized by one tiny little microscopic sperm, right? So, you know, in that case, the female's reproductive investment to the future generation, a lot of it is all invested in that one egg, whereas the male could, if he wanted to, fertilize lots and lots of eggs, right? So the optimal strategies of males and females may vary depending upon the certain circumstances or environment in which they live, and that can adjust their behavior. So, for example, in these prairie voles, or voles in general, so these are prairie voles, these are montane voles, so both voles but different species, and they live in different types of environments. With the prairie voles, they have monogamy, so a strong long-term male-female bond, okay? Often associated with a need for parental care for more than one individual. Yeah, so when you have that, it means that you know, both parents are required in order to sort of successfully raise those offspring that are produced. Whereas this montane vole is promiscuous, so males mate with multiple females, and the young are raised by the females alone. Okay, so very different types of behavior in the way that they reproduce. And this is controlled by their environment. So the strategy that maximizes the male reproductive success depends upon various factors. For example, if you live in an environment with a likelihood that offspring will survive without the male help, so if the offspring have got a good chance of surviving, even if I run away, then there's an incentive for the male to run away and mate somewhere else as well. And it also depends upon the male's likelihood of finding another mate. So if you've got a good chance of finding another mate, then you move on as well. If, however, you lived in some kind of environment where if you ran away, there was a low chance of that offspring surviving, then you would be more likely to stay and help raise it. If also you lived in an environment where if you ran away and you just couldn't find another mate, well, there's no point. So you might as well go back and make sure that that individual that you've already produced has got the best chance of survival. Okay, so a good example of this is actually anglerfish, deep sea anglerfish, that live in this huge realm of the deep sea in mid-water, and finding a mate is extremely difficult. So when they do find a mate, the male actually fuses to the female and becomes pretty much kind of part of it, because the chances of it leaving and going and finding another one are so tiny. And there are other types of mating systems as well. So one is polygyny, so one male and multiple females. So a male can basically dominate somewhere. So an example of this is elephant seals. If you go to the California coastline, and in some areas you can see this, parts where elephant seals will come and the large male will dominate a huge area of the beach. And this leads to many females mating with him because they need to be on that beach to produce their babies. And so they have little choice, basically, because that male has dominated that area. The opposite of this is polyandry, which is a rarer system. But that's where one female has multiple males. This occurs in golden lion tamarins, which are an Amazonian species, and becomes when multiple drones. Would bees also be considered polyandry? So I guess so. Yeah, when you get into those social insects, there's all sorts of other things that are driving. It's got a section in the book about social insects that we don't have time to move on to. But in this instance, it's driven by the fact that these are quite small primates that have a high predation rate upon them. And so, but they have, you know, the offspring require a lot of parental care. and they produce twins, which is pretty unusual for primates like this. And so what they do is the females mate with multiple males, and the males know that or know in inverted commas that those offspring need lots of care to survive. And because the female is mated with multiple males, the male is never quite sure whether it's its own offspring or not. So, and it's got a high predation rate upon it, so a relatively short lifespan. So they all stick around and help raise those juveniles because it might be one of theirs. We'll skip over. So salamanders, males and females, have multiple mating partners. I can't remember the details of what drives that. And in leks, this is where you often get this in birds, where males or females establish small territories just for displaying. So that you get this in things like grouse, etc., where they have in one communal area different grouse will congregate and defend little territories and try and attract mates to them. And there's a number of different hypotheses of what is causing that behavior to occur, but it's not a fully resolved issue of what the underlying selective pressures on that are there are. But in general, multiple different mating systems, depending upon the types of environment that the species live in. Related to this aspect is the same matriarchal group of animals with polygyny. Matriarchal polygyny. I guess so. In response to that question, Ileana, I haven't thought about that in detail. Matriarchal group with polygyny. So hyenas are matriarchal. I'm not sure if they're polygynous. They probably are. I'm not quite sure. Okay. So in terms of your, we've talked about reproductive behavior and trying to sort of maximize your reproductive output and fitness, basically. One of the sort of queries that has often arisen with this is this act of altruism. So altruism is an act of benefiting another individual at the cost to yourself. Okay, so you're going out and spending a lot of energy or perhaps risking your life to help another individual, and that doesn't seem like it should be selectively advantageous because you want to maximize your own fitness, not somebody else's, right? The theory behind this is related to this aspect of so-called kin selection. So kin selection is the concept where you're maximizing this aspect known as inclusive fitness. Okay, so depending upon circumstances, may select for behaviors that are costly to individuals. Inclusive fitness gains are maximized. So what do we mean by inclusive fitness? Because remember, you're trying to maximize your own fitness here. This is an example of inclusive fitness. If you think about how related you are to different individuals in your family, so if this is me and I have a child, that child is 50% related to me. And if I have a grandchild, it's 25% related to me. So this is how my genes get passed on to future generations, which is my fitness, okay? That's my my evolutionary fitness, passing on of my genes to future generations. However, there are other ways in which genes that I have inside myself can also be passed on to future generations. So I'm 50% related to my mother, 50% to my father. And if I have a brother or a sister, then they will share genes with me that will be passed on through their children, okay? So my grandnephew or niece, damn nephews and nieces the same with grandchildren. Yeah, so I can pass on some of my genes through there or through more distant relatives, okay? And so my genes into the next generation includes my inclusive fitness, which is this box here, my direct descendants, but also my indirect fitness, okay? The genes that are being passed on through other relatives, okay? That I share some of those genes with them. So part of the theory of this is based around Hamilton's rule, where that states that altruistic behavior is adaptive, in other words, it's beneficial, if my indirect fitness benefit to a recipient times my degree of relatedness, or in other words, how related I am to that, is greater than the direct fitness cost to me. So if it's costing me a certain cost and risk, for example, of helping or feeding or something another individual, the benefit that I'll get in terms of my fitness will depend upon how related they are to me. Okay, so I spend, you know, a lot of money and time and that kind of thing rearing my own children, but not other children that I've, you know, who I've never met. But you know, I give Christmas presents and things to my nephew and niece and things like that. So you know, there is some sort of intuitiveness to this, right? So this aspect of kin selection is related to explaining how this altruistic behavior kind of evolve, seemingly counterintuitive, but actually can have evolutionary benefits. So genes through my offspring is balanced through genes through your offspring. Okay, and we'll move quickly on. That's a summary slide, which I think is in the version I gave you. If not, I can update that, but I think that should be available to you, okay? And in the meantime, we'll move on. Yes, it is. Okay, good. Okay. Great. Close that one down. Find slide next. Okay. Some of these lectures and chapters are longer than others, so you know, time is relative here. Okay. Let's get into this one. So now what we're moving on to is the first of so that the lectures that we have for the remaining semester. I'm just looking at this my list above my computer here. So we've got 2, 4, 6 lectures to go, and all of those are in ecology. Okay. And so this is the first of those lectures in the ecology series, so called Ecology 1. Laser pointer. Okay. So this is on chapter 52 in the book, the physical environment and biogeography of life. So a good first question in this is, what is ecology? Okay. Ecology is the scientific study of the interrelationship among organisms and the physical environment. The physical environment is the focus of this first lecture in the ecology series, okay? So it's this relationship between not just animals, but organisms in general and the environment that they live in. And sometimes people confuse this for the concept of environmentalism, okay? So environmentalism is the use of ecological knowledge together with other considerations such as economics and ethics, etc., to inform decisions and public policy related to stewardship of the natural world. So people, you know, who advocate for, you know, saving whales or lay down in front of trees to stop trees being cut and things like that might come under the umbrella of environmentalism. That doesn't necessarily mean ecology. Okay, so ecology is perhaps being used for environmentalism as a science behind it, but it's not the same as environmental ecology. Okay. So in ecology, many of the different concepts in ecology are relating different scales of the environment and the animals or organisms that live within them. And as part of this scaling, one of the concepts is the concept of a population. Okay, and a population, so what is a population? It's a group of individuals of the same species in a given area that have the potential to interbreed and interact with one another. So if you're, you know, a group of monkeys that live on an island, and you can all move around that island and interact with one another, you're part of the same population. If there's another island, you know, 1,000 miles away that has the same species, but they have no way of interacting, then they are two separate populations of the same species. Populations are included within the community. So a community is an assemblage of interacting species living together in the same place and time, okay? So there might be multiple populations of different species living together that are part of the community. So as I mentioned, this fits into the sort of integration across different scales in ecology. Okay. So I'm just trying to see one of the comments that's appeared there. I can't see it, I'm afraid. Too many screens. You know, at the lower level, we have the individual, an individual organism, you know, the sea star living on a rocky shore. They are part of a population. So on that rocky shore, there are other sea stars that live there that they can interact and potentially breed with, okay? And on that same rocky shore, that population of sea stars is part of the community. So here we have some sea stars living there, but also I can see some barnacles, it looks like, some anemones, probably sponges or something here. So these different populations of different species are making up the community in the ecosystem. So the ecosystem includes the community plus the physical environment, the rocky shore that they're living on. Okay, so that's the ecosystem. If you move up a level in the scale, you can consider the landscape, which consists of multiple ecosystems. So here, you know, we were looking at this rocky shore ecosystem, so the rocky physical environment with the different populations living there. But that's part of this sort of coastal ecosystem where, you know, you've got some terrestrial ecosystems, you've got a sort of subtidal marine ecosystem, etc. Together, they're making up that that landscape. And then at the biggest level, you can consider the biosphere, so which is basically all of the ecosystems in the world or on Earth. Okay, so ecology tries to integrate, or often is looking at integration across these different scales. So how do ecologists study this? What are the approaches to studying ecology and the integration of scales? Well, one of them is observational science, where long-term monitoring studies, for example, might look at the changes in the populations or communities over a long time period. So, for example, in, you know, many instances, fisheries biologists do this because there are fish populations out there that are very economically valuable, that are being harvested, and so they want to monitor them over time because they want to see if they're changing and if they're sustainable, okay? And these types of long-term studies, they inform about the processes, so how do populations, communities change over time, but they can also be used in generating hypotheses. So you can say, I saw that population, you know, has halved over the last decade. Why is that? So, you know, is it because this other predators have increased? Is it because the physical environment has changed? It's got warmer or colder or wetter or something? You can generate relationships and hypotheses. You can also then test those hypotheses using experiments. So that's where you can do either lab experiments or small scale field experiments to see whether those hypotheses that you generated are correct or not. And they allow more rigorous experimentation and testing of hypotheses, so you can see if your predictions are correct if you, test those certain hypotheses. And then modeling is also a very important component of ecology. And what modeling allows you to do is basically try and relate these two different approaches. So experiments can be used to parameterize relationships, so give numbers that you can use in a model, basically. And then by constructing those models and relationships, you can see if then they reflect the real world as observed in your observations of the real world, okay? And you can maybe tinker with those relationships to see what process could be driving another observation. Because part of that physical environment, an important distinction, which I'm guessing probably many of you are aware of, is this difference between so-called weather and climate, okay? A distinction that many politicians would benefit from remembering, okay? When people talk about, oh, there's no such thing as, for example, global warming because it was snowy today. That's where remembering this distinction is important. So weather is a short-term state of atmospheric conditions. So what is it like outside today? It is, I'm looking outside, pretty sunny, okay, and a little bit breezy. That's the weather today. Climate, however, is a long-term average condition and variation, okay? So in atmospheric conditions at a particular location. So for example, this graph here shows, a span over 1,000 years or something, whatever it is. So yeah, 1,000 years of global carbon dioxide and temperature change, okay? So this is showing the average temperatures, how they've changed in different sort of time periods, for example, and there is variation around it as well. So that variation is part of the sort of description or definition of the climate of a different area. And allows you to sort of say that, on average, if I was going to fly to Florida, I would normally be, good taking a pair of shorts and a t-shirt because usually it's warmer there than if I was leaving from New York where I might need a jacket, okay? There are individual days when it's cold in Florida and individual days when it's hot in New York, and occasionally maybe Florida might be hotter than New York, but the average climate in those two locations is different, okay? So how are we doing here for time? 28. This is a 2-minute and 41-minute video that we will watch next time. Okay, so we'll pick up at this point next time in terms of physical environment, and what we're going to talk about is how is it that the Earth gets warmed or cooled. Okay, so ultimately the warmth is coming, that we feel is coming from the sun. So we're going to look at the different processes of how that energy arrives at the Earth's surface, how it leaves and goes back into space, and the balance between those in terms of how the world is, at a certain temperature at any one time. Okay, so we will leave it at that and continue next time. And thank you very much. Okay. Okay, no worries. And office hours from 2 to 3. Okay, I know at least one person who wants to come on. If I'm not there at 2 on the dot, I'll be there soon after. If there's somebody else already in the room, you'll have to wait until they finished, and then I'll let you in. Okay, the link for that is on Blackboard. Okay, thank you very much.